So, yes, okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Fionnuala's lecture on Jane Austen. Now, I'm sure I don't have to introduce her as a totally unfamiliar figure because you've seen her all week and at summer school, and I'm sure many of you are here because you've read her poetry and her novels. But I'd just like to fill in a little bit more about the background to Fionnuala, for those of you who may not be so familiar. She is D.Lit et al. at Phil. Now, a D.Lit is a little bit better than an ordinary PhD, as many of you will know. It's rather, yes, it is. It's somewhat superior. But she is is a woman of many parts, because not only is she a poet and novelist, she's an excellent editor. Those of you who've read her novels, and there are 4 of them, will perhaps know that The Fetch, which was the most recent, won the Herman Charles Bosman Prize in 2016. She has a new volume of poetry coming out this year, to be published in England by Bloodaxe, and it's called Pretend You Don't Know Me. That's rather a typical Fionnuala title, I think. And in addition to that, if it weren't enough to have written 4 novels and 4 collections of poetry, she has another novel with her agent at the moment, which is called Sound, or the provisional title is. And she is also editor of Aerodrome, which is an online poetry magazine. And in addition to that, she's a trustee of Poetry for Life, which is an organisation which encourages children to learn poetry by heart, which doesn't often happen these days, but it's a great resource for life, I think. And that is just part of what she does, because she edits and she teaches poetry individually and in groups, and she does spend quite a lot of time organising worthwhile things and events. And also I've known personally how she's found the time in a very busy life to come and speak to organisations like the South African Council for English Education and things like that. But I also want to share, some years ago, the university got a contract to upgrade the English of the parliamentary secretaries. And I'd just like to share a little anecdote, because Fionnuala and I were charged with upgrading the grammar. We had to go every time we visited the parliamentary buildings in Plain Street in which the course took place. We had to go through numerous security checks. We were beating up or down Plain Street in the teeth of a southeaster very frequently with all our paraphernalia and teaching. And although Parliament is pretty lavish with its upper echelons and providing food and so forth for them, they're quite parsimonious with the lower orders. And these people to we were teaching had nothing except sort of a cup of tea during the course of a long morning. And 2 or 3 mornings after we'd started, Fionnuala had a large box with her, and in addition to everything else. And I said, "What's in that box?" And she said, "Sandwiches." And Fionnuala had got up early in the morning and made those sandwiches for the students. Nevertheless. But her culinary talents are not limited to sandwiches. She makes a very, very decadent chocolate cake with strawberries as well, which we've all benefited from. But in extramural studies, I think you're required to have a great range of talents, and Fionnuala has them. You've got to have a very, very wide academic mind. You've got to follow current affairs. You've got to be very good with people, and you have to have. Got to be a jolly good events manager too. But Fionnuala has managed things like the Franschhoek Literary Festival, but that requires sort of an emotional sensitivity and a care for people, and also a willingness to engage with them. And as she's talking about Jane Austen and Persuasion, I'd like some of you to recall perhaps a passage from Persuasion, and it says, it was when Anne Elliot is talking to her cousin Henry and telling him how very much she enjoys good company. And he says to her, well, what do you mean by good company? And she replies, I mean the company of clever, well-informed people who have a great deal to say. So he says, but that is not good company, that is the best. And I'm going to leave you in the best of company, Fionnuala and Jane Austen. Thanks. Thank you.
Extremely kind introduction. This presentation began its life when I was a teenager and relates to my sense of excitement and surprise when I found the word cape cropping up in the works of my favorite author. I was reading Under the Desk instead of Johnny Tremaine. And last year, with the bicentenary of Jane Austen's death, that gave me the excuse to develop a seminar paper about Jane Austen's connection to the Cape. I'm particularly interested in what she knew about us, or our place, and how she acquired that knowledge. I hope in this lecture to show how, right at the end of her life, when she was struggling with what she called the flat ending of the book she was writing, the Cape of Good Hope, how well named we are, may have come to her rescue in some sense by offering a certain symbolism or artistic weight that allowed her to transform a merely good novel into something truly great, a novel Harold Bloom has described as perfect. I have this little slide about her family's longevity. The end of her life happened on the 18th of July, 1817. She was only 41. She had traveled to Winchester to seek medical help. And she's buried in the cathedral, which of course I'm very pleased about. I think that's fitting. But her illness was mysterious. It afflicted, if you look at those ages I've got there, it afflicted no other member of her long-lived family. You can see from the slide that her mother lived to 88, her father to 74, her brother George, with no picture, who was in some way impaired, perhaps deaf, lived to 72. And her sailor brother Francis, well, I have to quote Virginia Woolf, "We do not grudge it to him, but her brother the Admiral lived to be 91. The cause of Jane Austen's death has been the cause of many scholarly articles. I've read things about unintentional arsenic poisoning, perhaps because of a cream she used on her face, TB from drinking unpasteurized milk, Hodgkin's disease, the favorite culprit, Addison's disease, even an autoimmune disorder, a very scholarly paper written about how, because she was born at 10 months and not 9 months, as a post-term baby, she may have had some kind of autoimmune disease. And although I find these things it's a bit odd, it's never going to be solved. You're never going to really know, but I understand why these posthumous diagnoses are made and will continue to be made, because we can't understand why she died so young, and we'd like more books. because her brothers outlived her, they were able to set the mythologizing ball rolling. And apart from the gravestone at Winchester, which puts the benevolence of her heart above the endowments of her mind, there's a mourning poem by her brother James where he says, "Yet not a word she ever penned which hurt the feelings of a friend." I don't think so. He'd obviously forgotten Mrs. Musgrove's large fat sighings over her useless dead son Dick, which happens in Persuasion. Not just in Persuasion, but throughout her writing, Jane Austen was inserting direct or indirect references to the Cape of Good Hope. And the question is, where did her information come from? In the first place, from the man here, the first man, I can't remember, where am I? The man on the right. He is my right. Francis Austen. Although her younger brother Charles is the one most often mentioned in the literature, he's the one who saw a lot of action in the West Indies, it was Francis who was actually stationed at the Cape on and off between 1807 and 1809. And even from the age of 15, he was regularly sailing past the Cape and stopping off here as a midshipman. So these two boys went to the Royal Naval Academy in place of school. In fact, it was an education. And I don't know if Wentworth mentions it in Persuasion, but on board ship, there was education going on for these young midshipmen. And my argument about her getting this information is that the Austen family shared all the details of their lives in the form of letters. They kept letters, they read them aloud, and they summarized them to one another in yet further letters. So it was a real slog for Francis. His job was looking after the East India route in the time of the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. It was a slog going back and forth, St. Helena, Cape of Good Hope, India, China, on convoy duty, protecting all those ships full of opium and textiles and spices. And in a way, the East India Company wasn't just a business. The Navy was protecting it because, in a way, the East India Company was almost running the world. If you can imagine Woolworths running South Africa, something like that. And until the Suez Canal opened, do you remember the year? There was no alternative. It would have taken 3,000 camels, who knows how long, to carry what a single ship could carry. So Table Bay and Simon's Bay were very, very busy places, and they were cosmopolitan. The Cape was the stopping place, not just for the British, but for all nations. You would have heard all languages in the streets. If you look in the archives, you often see references to translation being needed from all manner of foreign languages. And there were fights about the currency value of different currencies that people were trying to exchange at the Cape, with the Rix dollar always being overvalued. Apart from her brothers, what other sources are there perhaps for Jane Austen to have known about the Cape? You're looking at a picture of her Aunt Phila Austen, her father's sister, who led an extraordinarily eventful life, as did her daughter in her turn. They were orphaned, and poor Phila was discarded by an unloving stepmother and then apprenticed at the age of 15 to a milliner in Covent Garden, which at that time was a kind of synonym for saying you're a prostitute. I don't know if you know John Cleland's Fanny Hill. And in it, there's a millinery shop which is being run as a brothel, and it's being run by a Mrs. Cole, and lo and behold, Phila Austen was apprenticed to a Mrs. Cole. So not surprising that the moment she turned 21 and received a very tiny inheritance from her father's estate, she used that to sail to the East Indies in search of a husband. She had no one there expecting her, no one in love with her, and she and 10 other women set off on this perilous journey around the Cape of Good Hope. Many people would die on those journeys. And in fact, the ship she sailed in, the Bombay Castle, is mentioned in our archives several times, coming into the harbour with damage. But they survived, and when they got to Madras, this fishing fleet, as these women were known, because they were fishing for husbands, were greatly welcomed by the huge number of single men, and who all fought each other to carry them ashore. And within 6 months, Fila had become Mrs. Tyso Hancock. He was, I think, a Surgeon General there. One of her shipboard companions married the man who was to become Clive of India. And for 7 years, Aunt Fila was childless. And then a strange and interesting thing happened. Soon after meeting Warren Hastings, she fell pregnant. There is circumstantial evidence, and in fact, one of the scholars says this was an open secret in India, that the child that was born, Eliza Hancock, was indeed the natural daughter of the Governor-General of Bengal. He gave his daughter, which we accept as a very handsome dowry, and in fact at some point doubled it. And he certainly took an interest in her son, who I imagine is his grandson, who was christened Hastings. Eliza was lively, flippant, outrageous, possibly the basis for Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park. Later, she and her widowed mother traveled to France, where she married a captain in Marie Antoinette's regiment. It is too little to say that he loves me, since he literally adores me. And he was guillotined in 1794, having made the incorrect decision to go back to France to see if he could protect his family lands. There is, of course, no guillotining in Jane Austen. But the stories of Eliza and Fila were at Jane Austen's disposal. And what had caught her imagination was the idea of traveling such a long and arduous route to marry a stranger, all because you were a woman and you had no money. And this crops up in a very early work written when Jane Austen was 16, called Catherine or the Bower. What I love about, can you see the manuscript page? Can you see the only editorial changes she's made? She cuts out Kitty, because that's too informal, and changes it to Catherine. And later, when I show you the manuscript pages from Persuasion, you'll see what a vast improvement in editing and reworking has been made. So the character Catherine or Kitty is sad at the beginning of the story. She's a young, pretty girl, and she's recently lost the companionship of 2 female friends who, because they have been left indigent by the death of their father, have had to go and find maintenance. That is the word she uses, maintenance in the form of work or a husband. And Kitty is particularly upset as she reflects on letters from the friend who has sailed to India just as her aunt sailed, and has married a man twice her age and has been unhappily married a 12-month. And Kitty wants to talk about this to other young women. And she says, to a girl of any delicacy, the voyage in itself, since the object of it is so universally known, is a punishment that needs no other to make it very severe. Do you pick up the Pride and Prejudice echo there? That the sentence forming that we're seeing. I mean, this is an astonishing sentence from a 16-year-old. And again, she tries to get this conversation going with her young female friends, but this is the response she gets from Miss Stanley. Well, I cannot conceive the hardship of going out in a very agreeable manner with 2 or 3 sweet girls for companions, having a delightful voyage to Bengal or Barbados or wherever it is, and being married soon after one's arrival to a very charming man, immensely rich. I see no hardship in that at all. And again, this is actually vintage Jane Austen. This is not the work of a 16-year-old as we would understand it. She knows exactly how to use out of the horse's mouth, damning the character through the character's own words. Miss Stanley's ignorance of geography That's very important. It comes up in Persuasion again. The women we admire in Persuasion are women who don't mix up the West Indies with Bermuda. The fantasy that the East India route is a delightful voyage, a 10,000-mile voyage in which there were almost always casualties, and quite a lot of sick people got dropped off at the Cape, one of whom we'll speak about later. It was a much longer journey than the most disruptive journey in Jane Austen's own life, which you may remember was the 50-mile journey to Bath, when her father and mother announced without any preamble, well, we've decided to resettle in Bath. And a critic has pointed out that these two journeys were not dissimilar. Well, the critic didn't point that out. She pointed out that the father's main aim, Mr. Austen's main aim in moving to Bath, was to try and marry off these two spinster daughters of his. So I think right early on in Jane Austen's mind, this idea of a long journey being linked to anxieties about the marriage market, and those anxieties being played out time and again in her fiction. Because we're talking about Jane Austen internationally, I thought I should just recap for you this myth, which I'm sure none of you believe in anymore, but the myth of Jane Austen's narrow focus, which flourished even until the 1970s, and in one of the cases you can read on the slide, as recent as 2000, the Norton Anthology of English Literature described her as the only major author who seems to be untouched by the political, intellectual, and artistic revolutions of her age. And I think that this misconception was partly bolstered by that famous self-deprecating comment that you see everywhere quoted about Jane Austen when she wrote to a nephew who was also hoping to be a writer and described the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labor. And I think just too many people have taken that too literally, have not heard the irony in it, have not understood the argument inside it about miniaturism, about how really hard it is. And I also think that people who have absorbed this idea of her being not vast have forgotten the compulsory humility of the female writer, which I think still continues today, but I will make that a separate lecture. Recent scholars, I'm going to cite only Peter Knox Shaw, a great mentor of mine, and Jocelyn Harris, both of them really helpful, their books really helpful in putting this lecture together. But recent scholars have shown how much in tune with her age she was. She didn't travel abroad, but her mind, connections, and correspondence reached much, much further than the 3 or 4 families in a country village that she spoke about. This is probably the Cape reference in Jane Austen that you're all familiar with. So 4 years after completing, or not completing, leaving aside Catherine or the Bower, 20-year-old Jane Austen was at work on the novel that would eventually become Sense and Sensibility. The year was 1795, and Jane Austen would have read in multiple newspapers the dispatch recounting the capture of the Cape and the Battle of Muizenberg. In the novel Sense and Sensibility, Jane Austen permits herself a joke about Constantia wine. Marianne, the sensibility sister, has been rebuffed at a public ball by the glamorous trickster Willoughby, a private joke of mine, to whom she thought she was engaged. And she has retired sobbing to her room. Her host, Mrs. Jennings, has a cure. "My dear," she said, entering, "I have just recollected that I have some of the finest old Constantia wine in the house that ever was tasted, so I have bought a glass of it for your sister." The reader is already relishing her illogical attempt to remedy gout and heartbreak with a glass of dessert wine, and is rewarded again when Eleanor replies, "Well, Marianne is asleep and needs her rest, so I'll drink the wine," and she promptly downs it. So one glass of Constantia wine compresses a whole lot of character study. We know that Mrs. Jennings is generous and kind, but she does want Marianne's tongue to be loosened by the wine. She wants to hear the gossip, what is actually going on. And Eleanor's character as well, her quick wit. And it's a lovely moment for Eleanor to be a little bit irreverent because she has to be so sensible the rest of the novel. So that glass of Constantia wine is such a wonderfully economical narrative device. It signals, I would argue, many of the political and economic revolutions of her age that Jane Austen supposedly ignored. It's Britain's new relationship with the strategic tip of Africa, the consolidation of its empire, global trade, consumerism, the rise of the middle class. Apparently, the late gouty Mr. Jennings, we hear, had got all his money in a low way, running a shop. By naming the wine, Mrs. Jennings draws attention to her wealth. And to this day, I've given you the latest prices from Macro, offering a glass of wine that costs 1,000 rand for a half-litre bottle would do the same. So looked at in another way, in Austen's work, the small is the large. Things happen locally but have a global resonance. I'd just like to briefly say something about the Cape, how the Cape was seen in the English imagination at about this time. In her lifetime, it had already established itself in the popular imagination. You had, among others, Sir John Barrow's account of travels into the interior of southern Africa, and also other works of botany and travel. Then there was a poem that featured the flora and fauna and inhabitants of the Cape that was considered irresistible enough to be plagiarized. It's an absolutely dreadful poem. It's actually deliciously dreadful. Cynthia to Leonora, an epistle from the Cape of Good Hope, and that's an illustration from the man who plagiarized the poem. And I discovered this plagiarism. Do you all know Gordon Brown? Are any of you book collectors? You know that book, Pictorial Africana? Anyway, he had handwritten in this book. This is plagiarized from the Gentleman's Magazine of 1738, and indeed I found the page. So whoever this author is had simply copied the Cape poem and passed it off as his own. And the book, you can, I stole this at Quagga Trading. George Curtis let me take this picture from the 1812 book that he was selling for many thousands of rands. And it's so interesting. If you bought it today, I think you would probably buy it for this picture rather than the poems. It's an engraving by the famous engraver Buick of Table Mountain, which he never saw, because you don't need to see the Cape, do you? You just write about it. And in the poem that is about the Cape, it's very flattering about our flora and fauna, but when it comes to the inhabitants, they are described as squalid, naked, dirty, untutored natives covered in grease and bedecked in entrails, who do not woo one another or experience the joys and visionary woe of true love, but simply have sex. So I just wanted to contrast that kind of recycled nonsense about the Cape with how Jane Austen was thinking about it and writing about it in what is actually the first extant letter we have from her to Cassandra. So she is writing about their brother Henry, who's already had a checkered career. Every family has one, the brother with multiple careers. And his hopes of heading to the Cape. Henry is still hankering after the regulars. He has got a scheme in his head about getting a lieutenancy and adjutancy in the 86th, a new raised regiment which he fancies will be ordered to the Cape of Good Hope. I heartily hope that he will, as usual, be disappointed in this scheme. So instead of using the Cape to highlight the supposed greater sophistication of the English gentleman who travels there, Jane Austen seems to be satirizing here the Englishman's naked profit motive. I mean, look at those words: hankering, project, scheme, fancies. They all point to an unattractive tendency to seek personal advantage. I'm going to get to Persuasion, but I found Jane Austen's possibly her only protest poem, and since it has a Cape link, I thought you might like to see it. It's an 8-line rant about what she considers the very unfair sentence meted out to Sir Home Popham. He had come here with Baird to recapture the Cape in 1806, and after he'd done his recapturing, full of patriotism and receiving word from an American ship in Table Bay that it was possibly the Spanish in South America would be ready to overthrow their French masters, so maybe he should go there and incite insurrection or do something heroic and anti-French. So Popham, without receiving orders from London, took 1,400 troops from the Cape and sailed across to South America. He thought, well, it would also be useful for the Cape because we were short of flour at that time, and there was flour in Buenos Aires. There was a lot of popular support to him because he'd been very brave and he's been very clever, an oceanographer, and he was recalled to a court-martial, and the sentence she's referring to is simply a very stern reprimand. So she was about 30 years old when she wrote that poem. At that time, she had moved with her sister and mother to Southampton to live with her brother Frank, the one who did convoy duty here. And it was out of necessity. The Austen woman had been rendered somewhat homeless by the father's death, and it was a useful arrangement because Frank had a new wife who would be expecting soon, and now she would have female company while he went off, and indeed he did. On March 1807, Frank sailed for the Cape. And the slide I've made you here brings together life and art, as I believe, and others too, they really come together in the novel Persuasion. So there is the portrait miniature. We know it is of Jane Austen's brother, and it is believed by scholars to have been painted at the Cape between 1807 and 1809. And I've put beside it the moment in the novel when a character called, we hear about a character called Benwick, who had been stationed at the Cape, probably under someone like Popham, and while he was there, he had a miniature taken of himself for his fiancée. But Fanny Harville is her name. But on his journey back to England to hand over this love token and indeed to marry her, she dies, and he arrives to hear the tragic news. If you've read the novel, you'll know that Wentworth is the hero who is sent to break this tragic news to him. And much to everybody's surprise in the novel, Captain Benwick, who was apparently devastated and heartbroken and inconsolable, switches his allegiances fairly quickly to Louisa Musgrove. And the novel, at the end of the novel, things are brought together as all the characters gather to prepare for this marriage of Louisa and Benwick. And Benwick, absolutely without any tact, has asked his late fiancé's brother to have the miniature reset by a jeweler for his new bride. A little bit, okay. So, and you really get Captain Harville's sense of injury there. This was drawn at the Cape. He met with a clever young German artist at the Cape, and in compliance with a promise to my poor sister, sat to him and was bringing it home for her. And I now have the charge of getting it properly set for another. The repetition of the Cape there could be, it could be an awkwardness if you feel that way. She was writing very fast. I'll talk about that later. She was already sensing the illness that would kill her. But I also think the repetition rather brings out a sense of wonder at the Cape, as if he's saying, can you imagine such a distance? He was so far away. Like Benwick, Francis, her brother, would have needed a miniature for his new wife. And it seems that he found a miniaturist here in Cape Town. And Jane Austen would have been there when the miniature arrived. And perhaps it arrived in person. Perhaps Francis came home holding in a package a miniature of himself. And perhaps Francis actually said those words. This was drawn at the Cape. You know, I met a clever young German artist at the Cape who has helped us with finding the provenance of this miniature. Alfred Gordon Brown, Pictorial Africana, 1975. He was the first to make the link between the real and fictional miniatures. And he did some archival research, and he found a German miniaturist called Jacob Freeman or Fruman. Both of those spellings occur in the archives if you want to do a search. A German artist who fell ill on the way to Bengal and petitioned the Cape authorities to be allowed to stay here. He advertised in the Government Gazette his services as a miniature painter and a professor of music and drawing. Peter Knox Shaw has found and transcribed Freeman's original petition and also his liquidation account, because he died in 1809, leaving a poignant trunk full of musical notes and a violin. Another Cape connection is that Francis Austen, her brother, kept a notebook while he was at the Cape in Simonstown. And apart from noting the availability of fresh water, good, firewood, scarce, and briefly outlining the position of the batteries, he made this observation about the inhabitants of Simon's Bay. The inhabitants are a mongrel breed, a mixture of many nations, but principally descended from the first Dutch settlers, whose language, probably a good deal corrupted both in ideas and pronunciation, is in general use. I see him here doing a bit of self-correction, going from mongrel breed, you know, all about animal husbandry, to a mixture of many nations, which is a sort of superior observation. Perhaps he recognized where that mongrel breed came from, his own nation's trading. Also in Francis Austen's notebook, perhaps one of the earliest references to Cork Bay, which would then have consisted, I do know that in Jane Austen's time there were no photographs, but this is the earliest photograph I could find of Cork Bay. It would have consisted of no more than a few cottages and a storeroom and some rowing boats. Frank might have taken a little clipper boat from Simons Bay to Cork Bay. They were running then because there was the roads, there were quicksands in Glencairn and that very rocky descent from Clovelly, from Cork Bay into Fish-Hoek, which was often impassable. So there were these little coasters running back and forth with supplies for all the ships at Simons Bay. I suppose a question that crosses my mind is, was Frank passing through Cork Bay on his way to Cape Town to have his miniature painted? But that is not mentioned in the notebooks, and I can only access certain quotations from the notebooks which were published in a descendant of Jane Austen, who I think holds the papers, Hubbock. You can find it online. So it's possible that in other pages he might have, but it seems that this journal was mainly kept for Navy reasons, for giving information about the Cape. Just one more argument in favor of Freeman being the artist who painted the miniature. There are precedents in Jane Austen's work where she is referring to a professional man. He is a real man. You know, he existed. So in Northanger Abbey, for example, the master of ceremonies at the lower rooms at Bath is a Mr. King, who was a real Mr. King. And in Mansfield Park, when Mr. Rushworth plans to bring in a landscape gardener, it's Humphrey Repton, the real landscape gardener. So a closer look at Persuasion. She joked to her sister that Pride and Prejudice was rather too light and sparkling. It wants shade, or the history of Bonaparte. She rose to the challenge in the last years of her life, writing a novel with considerably more shade than the preceding ones. If you have a copy of Persuasion with you, you could turn to the last lines of the book, otherwise I can read them to you. Anne has at last been reunited with Captain Wentworth, and we're sending her off into the sunset with him. And this is how the book ends. The dread of a future war was all that could dim her sunshine. She gloried in being a sailor's wife, but she must pay the tax of quick alarm for belonging to that profession which, if possible, is more distinguished in its domestic virtues than its national importance. I wonder how many people, if asked which early 19th century novel by a renowned author ends on the phrase national importance, would identify Persuasion by Jane Austen. And that ending is shade indeed, acknowledging the possibility of another conflict that could take Anne's happiness away from her yet again. It's a dramatic irony for the reader because of the way the timeline of the novel is constructed. You don't need to concern yourself with much of that, but the point is that Jane Austen and her readers had been through the escape from Elba, and they had been through the exile to St. Helena. Her characters exist in that moment of peace where apparently Napoleon is safe on Elba and they think the war is over. So there's this dramatic irony that she's created, and her readers will feel that pang for Anne. There is the possibility of Wentworth being killed in battle. So Persuasion celebrates naval officers because they've worked so hard and so courageously to protect England against Napoleon. And to some extent, the hero, Captain Wentworth, is a Horatio Nelson reinvented. Like the Nelson that Robert Southey celebrated, and which was published in Jane Austen's time, Wentworth has risen through the ranks from the bottom to the top. His habits of understatement, our touch with the great nation not having much improved our condition, the great nation being France, echoes the Nelson touch. Admiral Nelson praised Francis Austen as an excellent young man, just as Wentworth is generous in praising his friends. Captain Wentworth and Admiral Croft return from the war enriched. They are now men of position, of stature, because of what was called prize money. So if you captured an enemy ship, even an enemy ship that was a commercial vessel, you as the captain received a percentage of the value of that vessel. And they are seagoing men, and that makes a lovely contrast with the landed gentry that Anne's family comes from. They are so up themselves, obsessed with the baronetage, with precedence and status, and that's why she had to give up Captain Wentworth all those years ago, because he had no money and status. Now the roles have been reversed. Anne's father is in financial difficulty. He's going to have to let out Kellynch Hall to the Admiral, and Captain Wentworth, as a relative, will be a frequent visitor. And the question is, as we see Wentworth and Anne moving back together into one another's ambit after being separated for 8 years because Anne bowed to her family's wish, you can't marry a nobody. Now that they are coming into one another's ambit again, the question is, can he forgive Anne for, at the age of 19, allowing herself to be persuaded to give him up? Will he still find Anne attractive now that she is 27? Austen's next oldest heroine is Emma at 21. And her sister Mary tactlessly says, Captain Wentworth told me that your looks were so altered he would hardly have recognized you. And there's a lovely moment at the end of the novel when the characters are reunited, when Wentworth says to Anne, and they're just sharing their love for one another, and he says, you know, I visited my brother, and he said, is Anne altered? You know, so many years have passed. And little suspecting, says Wentworth, that to my eye you could never alter. Anne smiled and let it pass. So the novel, I think the novel's popularity, I mean, I'm using Goodreads here as a gauge for popularity. So on Goodreads, Persuasion comes just after Pride and Prejudice. And my feeling about the popularity of this novel is that it stems from the very tender way in which the text acknowledges the possibility of a complete loss of hope before it eventually and so beautifully brings the estranged lovers together. So in the background, there's always that Shakespearean sonnet, you know, love does not alter. And just a brief note about my view of the symbolic value of the miniatures in Jane Austen. They were, in the pre-photographic era, obviously symbols of commitment and had associations of secret and private emotion. They crop up in several novels, and I think they stand for the concept of a portable or a transferable heart. I'd like you just to think about portability and transferability. Portability is a good thing. You can carry a photograph of your loved one with you, and that is good. But a heart that is transferable is not a good thing, because that will lead to betrayal, fickleness. So that is the question, is Wentworth really willing to form a second attachment? And I think we are made to believe in the novel that he might. He might be able to make a second attachment to Louisa, or he certainly gets trapped into nearly having to make one. That's the Cobb, the harbour at Lyme, the backdrop against which the turning point of the novel takes place. I don't know why it's one of my favourite lines in the novel. It's just pointless. The young people were all wild about Lyme. They were wild to see Lyme. I mean, it's just wildness. What? They've gone there. Now they've gone to the sea's edge. Now we're getting naval. Now we're getting to the heart of the sea. They've gone there to visit Wentworth's friends as a party, and I think I want to ask you to think about Cork Bay Harbour and how, when those huge waves come over, there are still nutcases who run along it. Or when there are big waves crashing over the back of Dalebrook Pool, there are people who want to see whether they'll be killed. And because I think Jane Austen knew, just as we do, that the world is made up of one part thrill seekers and one part caution seekers. Now, Anne's problem is that 8 years ago, she refused to be swept away. She erred on the side of caution. And now, here at the Cobb, at Lyme, at this very dangerous spot, the couple who were separated by caution are about to be brought closer by recklessness. Not their own, someone else's. We've got Captain Benwick there, and we've got his grief established. Anne is at first sympathetic, but then she realizes he's really wearing his heart on his sleeve. He's enjoying being grief-stricken. And whereas she, who has a true grief, which you can see in that quotation, she's hiding it, she's bearing it, and he's kind of luxuriating in his alleged grief. What happens at the Cobb, for those of you who've read the book, you know, Louisa has been flirting so much with Wentworth that, in fact, everybody assumes they're going to get married, and if they don't, that will be the ruin of Louisa's reputation. She comes running down these steps and says her idea to land at the bottom is to jump into Captain Wentworth's arms. And she does that successfully once, and she loves it so much, she wants to do it again. He isn't there to catch her. She falls and knocks her head, and then everything in the novel changes, even Louisa. sometimes a blow on the head is a good thing. She stays on in Lyme to recuperate. She becomes a quieter, more thoughtful person. Benwick, who is living at Lyme, falls in love with her. And what does that mean? Wentworth no longer feels obliged to marry her. He was feeling obliged to marry her because everyone said, well, you've been flirting with her so much, you'll ruin her reputation. So only one thing remains. How is Jane Austen going to bring the characters, the lovers, together? She started to feel ill about a year before her death. In September 1816, she said she had back pain. In December, she declined a dinner invitation. She said she didn't have stamina to walk. Her symptoms were fever and nausea. And just knowing these things makes me admire her feat in completing this novel so much more. And what's fascinating about Persuasion is that unlike all her other published novels, her other grown-up novels, Persuasion is the only one where we have manuscript pages that we can examine the changes she made. And those changes eventually will incorporate that miniature. So we've got 16 heavily worked pages. Compare that to that earlier slide where Kitty goes to Catherine, and otherwise I'm well pleased with what I've written. She's working and working over this, over her manuscript, and she wasn't pleased. Even those changes she's made there did not please her. She felt the ending of the book was flat. What was flat was the way she'd contrived to bring the lovers together after their 8-year alienation. She contrived this complicated scene, and I'm so sad that the movie includes it. Smack. Wentworth is suddenly sent on an unlikely errand to ask Anne, are you about, so sorry to ask you this, but I've been asked to ask you, are you going to marry Mr. Elliot, your cousin? It doesn't work. Because Wentworth does the talking and Anne remains silent. She's been silent through the whole book. She's been silent with those thoughts you saw earlier for too long. Anne needs to speak. So Jane Austen was so unhappy with what she'd written, but she had the sense of urgency. She was having symptoms that she was worried about. She went to bed, she slept, she woke up the next morning, and somehow, in between July the 18th and August the 6th, she completely rewrote chapter 10 and composed the memorable, much-quoted scene at the White Hart Inn for chapter 11, where Anne so beautifully expresses her love for Captain Wentworth by seeming to speak about something else, by seeming to speak about men and women in general. And that conversation is made possible by the miniature from the Cape. The characters are gathered in the White Hart Inn in Bath. They're preparing for Louisa and Benwick's marriage. And the miniature that I referred to is now in Captain Harville's hand. Wentworth is writing instructions. Wentworth always helps other people with their painful duties. So, of course, it's horrible for Harville to have to do this duty, remembering his beautiful sister who died. Wentworth is writing the instructions to the jeweler to reset the miniature for a new bride. And suddenly, Harville turns to Anne and he starts telling the story about where this miniature comes from. And the word cape comes rushing into the text. We haven't heard about this miniature up till now. She's bringing it in at the last minute. The cape, a German artist, giving full, I think, artistic weight to an artifact. Poor Fanny, she wouldn't have forgotten about him so soon. And then uses this as an opportunity to talk more about the steadfastness of women versus the flightiness of men, how women are unable to forget. And there's this thrilling urgency as we realize that Captain Wentworth is writing these instructions, but he's listening. He's listening and he's getting the message. As she says that, unlike men, women are unable to forget because they are quiet and at home with little to do. Our feelings prey on us, she says. It's as if she's opening up this vast distance between England and the Cape, between men and women. He's eavesdropping, and he's doing it so intently that he drops his pen. Harville says, "Oh, have you finished writing the letter?" And Wentworth says, no, just another 5 minutes, please. I need to complete the task. And in that time, Wentworth scrawls his note to Anne. Harville continues to point out literary examples of women's inconstancy, and I'm pleased to say, points out that all of those literary examples were written by men. And they argue some more. They have a point of agreement that men are capable of domesticity and of loving. She only wants to win 1 point from Harville, and that is the privilege of loving longest when existence or when hope is gone. So the party, and that's, I feel that she's almost sending a message to her sister Cassandra, whose hope was gone after her fiancé Tom Fowle died in the West Indies. The party breaks up. Wentworth goes out, but then comes back in saying he's forgotten his gloves, and he's got the letter that he's scrawled in his hand and pushes it towards Anne with a look of glowing entreaty. And what you see is, in effect, his interior monologue, driven by having heard her speak. "I can listen no longer in silence. I must speak to you by such means as are within my reach. You pierce my soul. I'm half in agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever. I offer myself to you again with a heart even more your own than when you almost broke it 8 years and a half ago. I can hardly write. I'm every instant hearing something which overpowers me. You sink your voice, but I can distinguish the tones of that voice when they would be lost on others. Too good, too excellent creature, you do us justice indeed." This is when she gets to the part about men being capable of love. "You do believe that there is true attachment and constancy among men. Believe it to be most fervent, most undeviating in FW." Sorry about the initials. The word that jumps off the page is pierce. It's so beautifully positioned between pain and something exquisite. It's a pang. And he had used the word earlier in relation to Benwick. So, the miniature of Benwick, lying unwrapped in Harville's hands, has allowed Anne to speak of her own heart's non-transferable nature. Jane Austen's drawing on the miniature's associations with distance, with loss, with what might have been. We know that the miniature's necessary and desirable portability conflicts with its pretended symbolism of steadfastness. Their attachment is, in Frederick Wentworth's word, undeviating. Charlotte Bronte said of Jane Austen that the passions are perfectly unknown to her. But Persuasion shows a passionate Jane Austen thanks to her Cape connection. The author who in her earliest attempt at fiction sent a young woman to an unhappy alliance via the Cape of Good Hope, in her last novel brings a couple back to happiness via the same route. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.